Well, nice to see you all. And we're in two great places tonight. That is in Bethel and Shiloh. If you're talking to a Palestinian or a much of the world, we would say this is the West Bank or the occupied territories. If you're talking to Benjamin Netanyahu or President Trump for that matter, you are talking about Judea and Samaria. And if you're talking about the Bible, we're talking about the land that God promised to the Jewish people. So we're going to visit these places tonight in our study of the Scripture. This contest for this particular piece of land, which is a few square miles, they're close together in the area where they are. Shiloh and Bethel are close together. But there is a theological foundation for this place that goes back as far as almost anything does in biblical history. Very little would go earlier than this. And so we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12 and start with the place called Bethel. And I included this picture because this is of the tabernacle. But when we get to Shiloh, the tabernacle was located in Shiloh for 369 years. When Israel first came into the promised land, that's where they set it up. And so Shiloh was the first capital of Israel. That's a way of describing it. There are those who politically describe it that way. Even today, we might get around to that a little bit. But let's talk about the Bible first of all. Genesis 12. From there, Abraham went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. So this place, Bethel, which we'll see in a moment by way of picture, is on the spine of Israel. So there's, on Israel proper, there's these series of hills, mountains, if you will, that run the north and south distance of Israel. And Bethel would sit right up at the top of that. So it is I think I described it the other Sunday when I preached, if it's a razorback, it's the hump of the razorback where those places would be. And this is described here by none other than the Lord himself. Genesis 13 now. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from them, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So Abraham, we're talking about 1800 BC. So at Bethel, on this high hilltop, God says to him, look around. Look to the east, look to the west, look to the north, look to the south, because you can see the length of the land from there. I'm going to give this land to you. So God, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the people and all who dwell therein, Psalm 24 says. God owns the earth, and he gives a portion of it to Abraham. And he records it in the book of Genesis that we just read. This would be the most publicly stated land grant in all of human history. Nothing more permanently stated. It is a land grant which God gave to Abraham and to his descendants forever. And when you understand it that way, it definitely changes the way you think about a lot of different things. Now let me just show you when you go to that spot today, to Bethel, this is one of the things that you would see kind of on the top of that hill. This little building here is the remains of a Crusader chapel, as well as a Muslim prayer place. So both the Christians and the Crusaders and the Muslims recognized the sanctity of Bethel as a holy place. And we're going to go into more detail about that just a little bit later. I'm going to see if this is going to work. I have a little video here. Let's see if that... Well, it's not going to play as a video. It's going to show you a picture. That's Karen von Krosik up there. But in the area where she is standing, this is the area where you remember how they built the second king, or third king of Israel, Jeroboam, Rehoboam, those guys. They built 2 golden calves, one of which was at Dan, the other which was at Bethel. So there was once that one of those golden calves was in this location, and I think where you can see there's a little bit of a square where she is standing, and that would take it back to the time of Jeroboam and that particular high place. And you that are traveling with us on this particular trip, we will go to both Dan and to Bethel and see the places where these golden calves once were. Well, so God makes the promise to Abraham. When you talk about land like this, you want to remember God made the promise to Abraham, and then he made it to Isaac, and then to Jacob. In each case, there was an option. So it was Jacob and not Esau. And so that there's clearly a line that goes down through those three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where the promise of the land was reinstituted each time and restated to those successive generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in fact, God made the promise to Jacob of the land in this exact same spot. It's also recorded in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 22, and I'll read that. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. That was the original My Pillow guy, where, you know, the pillow doesn't lose its shape overnight. That's the thing about a stone pillow. That's excellent. It has certain drawbacks, however. Anyway, Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. So the same thing that he said to Abraham, now he says it to Jacob. I'm going to give this to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth, which is interesting that he basically promises God the tithe. Some people say the tithe is related to the law, but this is Jacob, and so this is 500 plus years before the law was given with its requirements. So it's an act of a person conscious of God's blessing, that God is the one who provides these things, and so I'm going to give a tenth. This is how Jacob recognized God's provision. And when we all give tithes, we don't give it based on the fact that it's an Old Testament law. We give it as a way of saying, God, you're the one who blessed me and who takes care of me, and so what you have given me, I return to you a portion. And that's the idea of the tithe, which Jacob here makes note of. My pictures aren't very good here, but this fellow, this is at Bethel. This fellow that's lying down there, his name is Eli Piepsz, which is Polish for pepper. But Eli is he's the executive director for the Yesha Council, which is the Council of West Bank Mayors in Israel. He comes from Mercer Island here, and some of the events that we've done in past he's attended here at our church. And so we've gotten acquainted with him better over there. And he is also a person who has shown various dignitaries around, and particularly in Bethel and Shiloh and that sort of thing. He showed Mike Huckabee around a while back. In fact, he sent me a picture the other day. I don't know if he sent it to me or I saw it. I saw a picture, I guess it was, of him with Mike Huckabee. And Mike Huckabee was at Shiloh on the 20th of March. Is that today the 20th? Yeah, so that would have been, they're ahead of us by a bit over there. So, but Mike Huckabee was at Shiloh today, along with Benjamin Netanyahu, and I just sent him a text message asking him if he was there with them, because I happened to find a picture of Mike Huckabee with standing in front of a red banner which says, "Make Israel Great Again," and in the same lettering of someone else who has that in this country. And the last time I was over there, Ellie here gave me a red hat which says "Make Israel Great Again." He's the one that developed that idea for over there, so I thought that was pretty cool. You notice here, this is the, anybody know what that is? You're reading in the notes. Yeah, very good. You're smart people. It's the Coronation Chair. And going back to King Edward II, I believe, was the first one to have his coronation while sitting on this chair. And but what's significant about it in this case is that stone. Because in English tradition, well, they took this from the Scots, by the way, back in the 1200s. But they say this is the stone upon which Jacob laid his head at Bethel. Well, I mean, that would give you a serious neck ache, that one there. But still, you can understand what the English monarchy was saying by that is that our monarchy is built upon the house of God. And so for all of these hundreds of years, every British monarch has had their coronation, and that's called the Coronation Chair. And so they want to make the association, if you will. My English history isn't terribly strong, but I think that Edward II, I don't think he was the one, you remember like Robert the Bruce and Braveheart? Yeah, that's Henry, that's Longshanks there. But I think that Edward II is not him, but Edward I, I believe, is the Longshanks, if I'm correct on that, which I very likely am not. But anyway, the stone, I mean, the Scots are still mad about it, but what can they do? But anyway, that's just a little interesting footnote on this particular. I saw that stone and heard what I'm recalling a lot of this from memory when I was a college student traveling in Europe. And I saw this chair, and I read the description of it there, and it's kind of just stuck in my head for all of these years. But there's a lot of interesting details about it. So in the story that we've been recounting from the Scripture, Jacob is about to go back to Haran, and God appears to him and says, "I'm going to be with you." The word that's used, he went to a certain place, and in the notes there I call it this idea that the place is in Hebrew, ha-makom, a word that has a religious connotation, a certain place, but it has a spiritual connection. So it's not just a place, but a place of great religious significance. That would be another way you could say that. And I'd like to just notice a few things about this. First of all, God is preparing Jacob for the challenges of the pagan city of Haran. Haran is a major city. We've talked about it here before. Center of trade in Mesopotamia. Kind of near where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are. It is one of those areas where today ISIS has remained as one of their strongholds. There's a long history of demonic activity in this area in Haran. It trapped Abraham's father there. He never escaped, although he was promised to go to the land that God would show him. He got stuck there. There's the temple to the moon god, Sin, who is there. It was one of the big important temples in times past. One of the interesting things about Haran, just to show you its pagan things and why God is preparing Jacob for this. So here you have a very much demonic activity in Abraham's time. You have it in Roman times because there was a fellow at the end of the 4th century named Julian the Apostate. He was part of Constantine's overall clan, but he was the guy who tried to take the Roman Empire back into paganism because it had been Christian now for a few, emperors, but Julian the Apostate tried to take it back to the pagan ways. And so he was on a campaign into Persia, military campaign, and so he stops in Haran and to consult with the gods there as to, and to actually pray for blessing in the temple of the moon god, with the crescent moon over the temple and all of this. And so he stops there and he goes on then on his Persian campaign. He is killed, assassinated on the Persian campaign, according to some idea, by one of his soldiers who happened to be a Christian. But nonetheless, they polished him off on that campaign. And in the Roman Empire, the city of Haran was the only city that officially mourned the death of Julian the Apostate. In the entire Roman Empire, the only city that mourned the loss of that particular emperor. I mean, what it tells you is that the people who were there had some pretty hardcore commitments to paganism. And that was the city to which Jacob is going to return. And the thing about these cities, in like Haran, it would have had a ziggurat, which is essentially a pyramid. You would see a lot of these kinds of pyramids, like among the Mayans, for example. A little bit different from what the Egyptians had, more like the Mayans, but nonetheless, these ziggurats, which were viewed as stairways to heaven. So Jacob is going to go to these places with the stairway to heaven. But God gives him a dream at Bethel and shows him the actual stairway to heaven. and the Lord is at the top of it, and he says these things to Jacob. So you can imagine when Jacob went back to Haran, where his family had connections still, and where they lots of stuff there, that he would certainly have been strengthened in his commitment to the Lord, that the God who is the God of heaven, the great God of heaven, is not going to be intimidated by these little brick, pyramids that they have built, which is their gate to God and their stairway to heaven and all of this kind of thing. So there's some notes there. So that's one thing. So I think God is preparing Jacob. The second thing is that God is reaffirming the promise of this land to Jacob. He gives it to his father, to his grandfather, and now to him. And it is the reassurance that the lineage of promised land is from Abraham, Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, and not Esau. And I point that out because there would be a good part of the world that would challenge these ideas. I had a professor at the university, Willamette University, when I was a student there, who was a visiting professor. He was from London. He wrote Nasser's Egypt, and he eventually became the head of propaganda for the Arab League. But he loved Egypt, and he helped me to acquire a love for Egypt at that time. And so I had lunch with him one day, and he offered 2 courses. He was a guest professor, and he offered 2 courses, and I took them both. One was politics of the Middle East, and the other was economics of the Middle East. And so I took both of his courses, and so when you have 4 courses a semester, and you take 2 from, he basically had 6% of my entire college education, undergraduate. But anyway, I was having lunch with him in the student union one day, and we were discussing this topic of whose land is Israel. And he said, well, you know that the Arabs are descendants from Abraham. And so obviously, this that we're studying now is something that a lot of people have read over the centuries and drawn certain conclusions from. So the Arab counter to that this belongs to Israel, he said, well, if it was given to Abraham, then the Arabs would have claim to it as well, since they would claim Abraham as their father as well. And Abraham would have been the father of many tribes, including Arab tribes that are part of the world today. But that's why it's important to point out that the promise was to Abraham, but then it was made to his son Isaac and not Ishmael. And then the promise was made to Isaac's son Jacob, but not Esau. And so the line did not deviate into the Arab sections, but it stayed on the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose name was changed by God to Israel. And so if you're going to trace those to whom the promise was given, it clearly ends up with Israel and not with the Arabs. But it was an interesting discussion that we had at lunch that day. So the promise is to Jacob through him. Thirdly, verse 14 is a prophetic promise that Jesus would be for the whole world. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and the east, to the north and south. All people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And I think it's important to note, because some people have said, well, this means that the world will be blessed through the Jews. And I think there's actually an element of truth to that. When you consider how many Nobel Prize winners, for example, have been Jewish, it's an extraordinarily high number. And the number, the contribution of Jewish scientists and doctors to the advancement of the world is remarkable. For such a small group of people to have such an inordinate influence, they have certainly blessed the world. I think I was telling Gary the other day that if you go to Israel and you have a medical problem, there's probably more doctors per square inch in Israel than any other part of the world, and good doctors, and they have good hospitals, good medical care. And so if you're going to be sick, that's as good a place as any to be sick. But yet, I would like to avoid even the best doctors, if at all possible. But anyway, I do think the promise is fundamentally about Jesus. Through Jesus, the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the blessing of the world would take place. And that is that we can have eternal life. And it is beyond a particular group of people, but it's all of those who are by faith the children of Abraham. Fourth thing, verse 15, is quite personal to Jacob, and he relied upon it when he wrestled with God. When God said, I'm with you, will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And Jacob, you remember when he wrestled with God? And God had to, put his hip out of joint and such like that. This was in his mind as he wrestled with God. And he reminds him of it. And so it was personal to Jacob, and he believed God, if you will. And fifth, the house of God is the gate of heaven. Jesus would pick up on this statement later. When Jacob said in that, I underlined and highlighted there, said, this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Now let me read you a little bit out of John chapter 1. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus said, you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that. He then added, I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Well, there's no ladder here, as in Jacob's ladder. What there is the same terminology as Jacob's ladder, but here Jesus said, I am the one upon whom the angels will ascend and descend. That is, the access to heaven, back and forth, is through Jesus. He is the ladder, if you will. It's another way of saying, another place he says, I am the door. But here he's really saying, I am the ladder. And so when Jacob saw angels ascending and descending, Jesus takes that and brings that over into the New Testament and says, I am that ladder. I am that access to heaven. And no one goes there except by me. And Bethel was the place where Jacob's name was changed to Israel and where God reiterated the promises made to Abraham. Genesis 35. After Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will come from your body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up the pillar and on like that. And we've already commented this is the place where the golden calves were set up. My pictures are a little bit out of order here, and so I'm going to zip through some of these because I want to come back to when we talk about Shiloh. And I can't believe I didn't change this. I just added these pictures today. I wanted to get pictures of, let's see here. Here we go. This is taken today. That's Mike Huckabee and Benjamin Netanyahu, and they are at Shiloh. And Huckabee visited there, and here's that banner that I was telling you about. And that's the one I sent that picture to Eli Piepsch and asked him, are you there? Because that's his slogan, that's his logo, that's his deal. And he has a website. If you probably go and look it up, you'll find it. But anyway, that's Huckabee there speaking. But Huckabee went there also in 2015 when he was on his run for president on the last go-around. And he was there in 2015. And he said about these places that we're describing tonight that this is Judea and Samaria. This is the land that God promised Israel. And he was taking his stand on that issue. So that I think was very important. I was Mike Huckabee's campaign chairman for the state of Washington when he ran, and we were able to get him actually 3 votes, electoral votes, but it didn't go too terribly far. But anyway, that was what took place there today. Sorry, I'll get back there eventually. Wait, oh yeah. Sorry. I'll show you those pictures in a little bit. Don't look now, you're cheating. Okay. So do you anybody want to make a comment about Bethel before we move to Shiloh? Okay, you can ask questions later. And Jeff, you'll monitor the web if you would, please. So let's do a little bit about Shiloh. The reason Shiloh is most significant is because the tabernacle was there for 369 years. And this one is actually from the Negev. There's a full model down in the Negev of the tabernacle, and I'm going to show you pictures of that because this is, it was with the Israelis in the wilderness. When they left Egypt, they built it there, and then it went with them with the Ark of the Covenant and all of that. So they basically packed it up whenever they moved, and you can see that it's made out of materials that were packable. You could move them, but. So they did that. But this is down in the Negev. No, it's in the Sinai desert, really. It's very close to Eilat, so it's way down in the south. And, when it was originally situated in the wanderings, that's the kind of landscape that they're dealing with. It's a pretty rugged territory. And I don't know, that would be probably a little bit like, in our Utah, there'd be places that look a lot like that. But these are pictures of that, just various shots. Some of our group down in there. There's the altar out in front for the burnt offerings. That's Kent Redfern, pastor from Anchorage, there in the black T-shirt walking. There you can look down inside where the offering, so there's a grate down there, there's fire underneath. The barbecue is put on top of that, and the burnt offerings it's not a barbecue, but that is the altar in front of the tabernacle. This full-size model is, you got some people set up there as just to help you see it. By the way, you look and see, like on that fabric that goes down, you see the angels there. That would be one of the cherubim that God said, inscribe it into the fabric of the tabernacle, because I want people to know about the cherubim. I want them to see it. So on the tabernacle, he said, do this. He said it on the temple that Solomon built. Carve these cherubim in there, because I want you to see that the cherubim are the guardians of the sacred presence, of the presence of God. And just to relate that to where you are now, there's 97 angels represented in this room. And they are the cherubim, which are always shown as guarding the presence of God. And who can tell me what the 4 faces or the 4 elements of a cherub would be? Who said that? Yeah, the wings of an eagle, an ox, face of a lion, and the wiliest of all, a man. So face of a man, an eagle, a lion, and an ox. So the cherub is a combination creature. And by the way, sphinx means exactly the same thing. A sphinx is a combination character of the same type as the cherubim. And I think that the sphinx that you see in Egypt, and in fact you see all over the ancient world, in every one of those ancient cultures, Babylonian, Sumerian, all of them have the sphinx represented, which is actually the cherubim. But here, God wanted them. So like at the four corners of these pictures, you see a strange-looking creature that is almost like it's a lion and has almost a human quality to it as well. Those are the cherubim. I had Dan Rice carve those. Those picture frames are all hand-carved. But I had him put the lions in the corners. And, of course, you see the lions' heads up in the ceiling in the shape of a cross. But those represent, in the 4 points of the cross. Those are the cherubim. There's in each of the they're just all over in the chapel in various ways, and some other day we can find them all. But I wanted to do that to show that the presence of God is guarded by the cherubim. In old churches, in centuries past, you would always have the cherubim and the seraphim in the corners of the sanctuary. Each of the corners, they would be there. Sometimes they show them with their wings covering their eyes and such like that. But anyway, that's that. This picture, that's Pastor Jay down there at the altar. And there is the laver for the washing. And here we are, some of our group gathered around that, having a look at it. Here is inside the holy place. Some of our group, there you see Pastor Jay, and who is that? Is that Rozzy and Grant and Jazzy and Jay? And that blonde-haired guy, I'm not sure who he is. But there's theirs, Ark of the Covenant. That's Sandy taking a picture there. This is our Ark of the Covenant here, with the poles so that it can be readily moved. Going back to the ark that they have down there in Israel, you open it up and you can see the almond branch that budded, the Ten Commandments, and all the stuff that was in it. There's Pastor Jay in the holy place with his guitar, leading a little bit of worship in that spot. These are all pictures, and this one is not at Shiloh, but I include these pictures here to show you that the significance of Shiloh, the first capital of Israel, but for 369 years, once they reached the Promised Land, this is where they set it up. And all the way down to the time of Samuel, the time of David. It's the Ark of the Covenant was there in that spot. And I took this picture off of BiblePlaces.com. As you can see, that's a great website, by the way. But it shows you some of the excavations. And I don't know if this answers your question, Carrie, but you notice this illustration. The place of the tabernacle points out the summit. Then you have some new excavations, Byzantine. There's excavations that have gone on all through here because there's quite an extended history. But this is the place that they identify, kind of down in this little bowl, if you will, where the tabernacle was located in the time of Judges and 1 Samuel, before it moved to Jerusalem. 150 feet long, 75 feet wide. And one of the things you notice about this is that the temple or the tabernacle actually kind of set down like in the bottom of a bowl, or like a modern-day stadium, actually. And these hills surround it. And there's all kinds of pottery in these hills that we've actually picked up some. But when they would go there, like for the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the things that you would do is you were told to eat your food in the presence of the Lord. And so literally they would take, because this is in the fall, kind of like our Thanksgiving, they would go to this place where God told them to go, where the tabernacle was. They would bring their offerings from their harvest of grains and fall grains, not spring grains, or not like the barley, but the fall, but also animals. And they would offer sacrifices, but they were to eat it in the presence of God. So all through these hills, people would be sitting down and eating their food, like a big picnic. And they would have special plates made out of pottery that they would use for this purpose only, and then break them because it was holy. It wasn't to be used for eating lunch when you have a bologna sandwich. You know, it's holy to the Lord, and so you eat your food off of this plate and then smash it. And so you can find all through these hills this kind of pottery. Still today, that goes back, we're talking, it's been sitting there for millennia. But what's interesting about it is the location kind of down inside this stadium, natural stadium. The same way that Temple Mount is surrounded like the Mount of Olives and these other hills, Mount Ophel, where you can sit on those hills and you can look down into the tabernacle or the temple. You can see the priests coming and going. You can see the animal sacrifices being offered. You can see the smoke rising up from the altar for the burnt offerings. And all of this, it's not like here we go inside the church. That wasn't how the tabernacle was set up. It was set up where the priests did the work inside the temple, but then they would go out into the courtyard for the sacrifices. And there's a lot of animals moving through here. There's a lot of blood on the outside and all kinds of stuff. And so, but anyway, it's just kind of interesting. And here's some pictures of us just kind of wandering around, looking at this spot. See, now that gives you, looking north, you can see another, the hills, the way they're located around it. But I think that's my wife there. There's Jazzy looking down at this area where everybody's kind of milling around. That's the flat area where the tabernacle once stood at Shiloh. And there's Ellie Piepsch. And we're having a little chat down there. This is the exhibit, if you will, at Shiloh. It's very cool. Let me just see if this one works any better than the last one did. Nope. Well, let's see. Nope. Well, so inside this, you notice the glass windows in that kind of that middle section. They have it set up to where you sit inside there, and you look out through these windows that are kind of like tinted. And looking out at the hills, at the place where the tabernacle used to be. And then they crack out a video which they shine on those windows, so it causes them to go dark and kind of blots out the back, but it superimposes the tabernacle and the festivities of the tabernacle over the site where it took place. And it's a pretty cool kind of a deal. And I'm sorry I can't show it to you because I haven't figured out all these details yet. But anyway, so here they are at that place called Shiloh. Let me leave that picture up there for a while. Okay, so let's go back and do some of the scripture now on Shiloh. Where the Ark of the Covenant was. Joshua chapter 18. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, or the tabernacle. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. So Joshua said to the Israelites, "How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of Israel, of your fathers, has given you?" And so Shiloh is the place not only where the tabernacle was, but it's also the place where the land is divided up again for an inheritance. So basically they say, okay, Judah, you get here, Benjamin, you get there, Ephraim, you get there. And so they basically divide up the territories. And I don't know how my map, I had some maps that when I work off of about 4 different computers. And I have one in my office at home. I have one in my bedroom at home. I have one that here at the church. And then I move it back and forth on, sticks from one place to another, because most of my pictures are on my office computer at home. And except, when you go to transfer, you move it on to the next one, and you don't get all this. Anyway, that's my excuse for today. I'll try to come up with a better one for next week. But anyway, so they divide up the land there. One of the sad things about Joshua is that God gave him the promise when they first were down by Jericho, just coming into the land. He said, everywhere your foot goes, I'm going to give it to you. Everywhere it goes, I'm going to give you that land. And the problem with Joshua is that as great as he was in so many ways, he never actually finished the job. And so there are places around the land that was allocated to the tribes, but though Joshua had the promise, he didn't go after it. And, so around Mount Lebanon, for example. And there's any number of places, even where Jordan is today was part of what was allocated to the Jews. But for whatever reason, they didn't finish up the job. And you could say that a great many of the problems we have in the world today stem from that fundamental failure. When you don't live up to the promises that God has made, or when you don't seize them and stand on them and appropriate them, you cause problems. So believe God, what He says, and go for it. And anyway, that's. And it's interesting that my buddy, who is Build Israel Great Again, he really sees himself as he is. He's one of the descendants of Abraham, one of the descendants of Israel, that God said, I'm going to bring you back to this land. And that the fact that he would leave Mercer Island and a very cushy life here with his kids and move back there, they very much see it as living up to the promises that God has made. And for my money, that's something I want to stand with. And that's why I appreciated Donald Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's the capital of Israel, and our embassy should be there. Everybody promised it, nobody did it, except for the guy who doesn't care what you think. He did it. And, that's pretty amazing. I was talking, we all have, I don't know if we all, but a lot of folks have ambivalent feelings or various feelings about President Trump. And the way I think about him is that he's not nice, but he is necessary. And so, because it's necessary not to be nice at this point in time, because there is a battle going on. And I'm just grateful that he's fighting on, generally speaking, the same side that I am. Shiloh is also awesome in that it is the place where the tabernacle was when one of the great moments of biblical history takes place. And that is, in fact, let me just read a little bit out of 1 Samuel. This man, Elkanah, verse 3. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phineas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Panaya, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hanna he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hanna went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hanna, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hanna stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hanna wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hanna was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hanna replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not make your servant out for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And so God hears her prayer. And what was the name of the child that was born that she gave to the Lord? Samuel, one of the great figures of the Bible. And so many beautiful stories related to him and his childhood and his mother and all. But anyway, and one of the interesting accounts here is of the calling of Samuel, and it's worth reading and just kind of noting some of the details. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. So when it says the lamp of God had not gone out, what's he referring to there? You're being quiet, but it's the menorah. So the 7 lamps, that burn before the presence of God, here it's called the lamp of God. And what's interesting to me is that Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. So here's this kid, and he's, Eli's old, and Samuel basically has the run of the place. I mean, what in the world? You know how holy the Ark of the Covenant was, right? He's in there sleeping where the Ark of the Covenant was. And, but I was a preacher's kid. I grew up in church. And, I've slept in a lot of places in church over the years. I remember one time when I was little, maybe about this age, I fell asleep at church and my parents went home. And there I was on the front row of the church, still sound asleep. Of course, it's not as amazing as it sounds because we actually lived in the church in those days. And my bedroom was actually like if you were to, let's say here's the chapel, which is smaller than this building. And right there was a door and my bedroom was right there. And so it was a Sunday school classroom on Sunday morning, and there was only a curtain that divided it from where the other people were. And so in my bedroom, there was only my brother and I, and there was a freezer there with a green light on it, and one dresser, and that was it. And then a curtain that you could pull back, and it would be exposed like where they do the Wednesday night service and stuff like that. Well, that's how I grew up in church. I mean, literally. And I didn't have to worry about going to Sunday school. Sunday school came to me. If you didn't get out of bed, they'd be sitting on your bed with you in it, And I was a bedwetter when I was a kid, and so, I for sure made sure that I got up early enough, but because it could be embarrassing to a little kid. But anyway, it's just interesting, thinking about Samuel. He's sleeping where the Ark of the Covenant is. So he clearly has the run of the place, and he can sleep wherever and it's not that big, so, but it's just interesting. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other time, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or by offering." And so, in time, Eli himself, his two sons die when they try to take the Ark of the Covenant out into battle. Eli hears the word. He was a heavy man, falls over backward and breaks his neck. Tell Linda she's lucky. But anyway, but that was the end of the house of Eli. And Samuel, of course, finds his place as the representative of the Lord after that. So all of that story of Samuel and his early days, that all is at Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was. But God's removal of his presence from Shiloh, when the Ark of the Covenant was moved, is basically a feature of God's relationship with Israel, and it's spoken of in other places. So in Psalm 78, verse 60 and 61, "He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among men. He sent the ark of his might into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy." So you think about God's presence was literally at Shiloh for 369 years in the Ark of the Covenant. And it is interesting to go and stand on that exact spot where that was for all those hundreds of years, and to realize where you're standing is where the literal presence of God was on the earth for centuries. It's just remarkable to think about that and to be aware of it, because you look around, it's just mostly dust and rocks. But you realize what has taken place there. And when the Ark of the Covenant, remember this was when they took it out to fight against the Philistines, and it was captured, and they took it down and put the Ark of the Covenant in their temple to the god Dagon. Remember that story? It's one of the funniest stories in the Bible, in my opinion. Do you want me to tell it to you the way I tell it? You got time? So the Philistines capture the ark. So we got Israel's God. So we're going to take his thing down and put it in front of our God. And of course, the next morning they go there and their God had fallen down. And so they set him back up again and do it all over again. And the same thing happens. Dagon falls down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And then the people were struck with tumors, the Bible delicately says. But do you know what the tumors were? I mean, they were hemorrhoids. I mean, the people were struck with a terrible matter of hemorrhoids. And just think about that. God strikes them with that. And anyway, I mean, women who've had children and such can appreciate these probably more than anybody else. But anyway, and what was the answer? How did that problem get solved? Well, number one, they had to return the ark. But do you remember the other part of the story? Well, they had to present an offering to God. And so they hired an artist to make golden tumors. And so literally, he makes these gold pieces in the shape of these hemorrhoids. It's the funniest thing. Can you imagine this artist? He goes to art school and studies to be a fine artist. And finally, he gets his government commission, and you are the finest worker in gold that we have in the land. And your assignment is to make a whole bunch of golden hemorrhoids that we can offer to the God of Israel so that this plague will be lifted off of it. I mean, that just strikes me. That has got to be one of the funniest stories that you can imagine. And of course, the Bible, you don't pick up on it because in the King James, and I'm not sure what the NIV, I think it both say tumors. But that's what it is, what I just described to you. But I just think about the guy who's the artist. But God clearly has a sense of humor. I just think that's, retribution, I said, I'll tell you what you guys are. And he showed them what he thought of them. But anyway, and so let's go back to the actual Bible here. That was Bible, but my version of it. Jeremiah chapter 7, you have a similar description of all of this. What God would do to Solomon's temple. He said, "Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, the place I gave to you and your fathers. I will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all your brothers, the people of Ephraim." So what God did at Shiloh with the rebellious Israelites, the Israelis, it became a byword. And he said, what I did there, that's what I'm going to do with Solomon's temple. And you're going to see it abandoned by God's presence. Because the thing that makes a tabernacle great, the thing that makes a temple great, is the dwelling of God within it. When the presence of God leaves, then it is no longer of any consequence. It's just a bunch of stones. It is nothing. And you don't want to be the place that God abandons. You don't want to be the person that God says, you want to go that way? Feel free. And let people go their own way. And so, in a way, God's judgment on those places is very valuable because, the Bible says these things are given as examples for us. So we read this stuff and we see that you just can't keep going in an ungodly direction and expect that nothing negative is going to come out of that. There's a day of judgment for every nation, for every person. It's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. And the presence of God that was known was very valuable, but it needs to be preserved. I was talking to one of my pastor friends. I don't know, some of you know Wayne Taylor. He and I are both the same age, and he pastored a great church over there in Seattle. But so he wanted to get together and talk about our stage of life. But we were talking about, I was telling him the story of Carmel and Elijah going to Carmel to rebuild the temple. Rebuild the altar, rather. The altar that Saul had built in his better days. But Saul, though he built an altar to God on Carmel that a great one like Elijah would restore, yet Saul did not walk the walk, and he went his own way, and he paid a fierce price for it. And just say that you have those who abandon the faith and those who restore the faith. And Carmel illustrated that, and the altar there. Elijah rebuilds it, what Saul had built in his better days, but then lost out. And Shiloh, in many ways, is a sad story, because God's presence was there in such a powerful way, but they didn't do right by the Lord. And so it became, and look, and when you see it today, it's nothing. I mean, obviously it's become a heritage place, and so there's things that are going on now to kind of restore it from a heritage point of view, but in terms of the presence of God, you can see how sad it is. In fact, the whole of Israel, in many ways, is like, especially when you go up to around Bethel and Shiloh. I mean, these are barren hills. When you saw the pictures, nobody cared about that place for centuries. And the only time anybody started to care about it was when the Jews came back, and the Arab says, we can't let you have that pile of trash, with those bunch of stones, that belongs to Islam. And so, my favorite line on that, nobody heard about the man who never kissed his wife but shot the first man who did. I mean, that's the story of Israel today. The Arabs never cared a lick about it for centuries until the Jews wanted it, and now suddenly it's all very holy land. So that's the way that goes. But, you can read the Scripture, and it informs us today of what's going on, and it lets us know where, in my opinion, we ought to come down. Because if God promised that land to Jacob and his descendants forever, I'm for that. And I don't want to be a person who opposes that. I want to be a person who supports that to the extent that we have the capability of doing that. So that's why I want to go visit the embassy in Jerusalem. It's very small. You can't go tours of it because it's so small. But it's there, and the flag flies over it. And I want to go to Bethel, in part, just to go and say I'm with God and what he said there. So, okay, let's see if we have any questions or comments, either live or online. And yes, sir, I'll try to repeat your question. Go ahead. The last knowledge in history that's recorded that we have is with Jeremiah. That's the last written recording. Now, did the Ark of the Covenant exist in the temple after that the Romans took? They took the menorah. We know that pretty clearly. They took probably the table of showbread. But there's nothing that's representative of the ark. But in the book of Maccabees, it describes that period in Jeremiah's time where he said, take it and hide it on Mount Nebo. And so they did. And then they went back later to mark the spot, but they couldn't find it. And so Jeremiah said, well, this is what God has established, so let it be. And so that's the last recorded evidence we have in history of the Ark of the Covenant. 586 or thereabouts, BC. Yeah. I mean, you have people today, who say they know where the Ark is. You have certain people in Israel say, well, it's under Temple Mount. You have Ethiopians who say they have it in a church there. There's all kinds of these things, and the only good of those things is they make for good TV. It's kind of like searching for Sasquatch. You go through all the evidence, and you almost saw him, but just didn't quite get the photograph, and or it was just really hazy, But so it's like that. So it's fun to watch those programs, and I do, but. I don't, and I had a good friend who was a member of this church, Gary Collette, who believed that the Ark of the Covenant was buried at Qumran. And he spent many, many years looking for it down there. And I would give him money from time to time, just in case he did find it. I wanted to say I invested in finding the Ark. But I really didn't believe that he would, and he didn't. And so I think it is hidden and will not be revealed until the time that Ezekiel describes at the end of Ezekiel, the restoration of the third temple. And then it'll be found. And maybe it'll be on Mount Nebo, and maybe it'll be somewhere else. Maybe they'll come and get our menorah here. and say that's the closest thing we've got to it, and we'll get that. So, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. The question that he asked for you that are watching online is, what was the last word we have in history as to the location of the Ark of the Covenant? Okay. How do we know exact places of things? Man, I ask myself that 3 or 4 times a day when I go into a room and try to find something. But the question is, I presume, as it relates to Bethel and to Shiloh, how do we know that these are the exact places? With regard to Bethel, like, for example, Genesis says that Abraham pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. And we know from the entrance of the Israelis into the Promised Land under Joshua that they fight the Battle of Jericho. Then they go up one of the 3 roads up into the interior and fight the second battle at Ai, right near where Abraham pitched his tent. And so you've got these kinds of records. They find like the remains of Jeroboam's temple that he built, his shrine there. It fits the dimensions that they knew. They find the footing stones and that sort of thing. It's just not that big of a country, and the descriptions of it, of where they stop, when they're going. I mean, there's enough geographical clues. With regard to the location of Bethel today, the current location was, well, first of all, the Crusaders had it. Before them, the Muslims identified it in that way, and they were relying upon Jewish knowledge prior to that. So you've got a relatively current sequential groups that identify Bethel in that particular location. Then in the 1800s, I forget the fellow's name, the archaeologist, who used names, and the name Bethel is very close to the Arabic name for the village there, near there, and I don't remember Beitin or something like that. And what you do find is that many times these towns have very similar names in Hebrew, in Greek, in Arabic, that they'll be that they will sound a lot alike, even though they'll be spelled somewhat differently, but in the various languages, so there'll be continuity of that. So in Bethel, I think that would probably be the best, the kind of the factual details of how we know that. At Shiloh, the excavations there, and in some cases, they find mosaics and things like that. And I cited you finding of the pottery and pottery from those periods that's consistent with the activities that would have taken place at Shiloh. And so you can put a lot of those clues together to come up with those. But that's the study of archaeology and of language sometimes. And so, I don't have an issue with any of these as being the authentic locations. The best of the science that's available to us would suggest that, and so I say you go with that. Yep. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, it's overlooking the area where that was at Shiloh. Yeah, yes. This was just built in the last few years. Yes, but that tabernacle is way in the southern part of Israel. No, it's not there. No, it would be nice to put it there because that's where it actually was. But of course, the group that operates the tabernacle, it's out in the wilderness Sinai, and at Timnah, it's the national park there where they have it located. But it's several hundred miles, 200 or 300 miles, 200 miles maybe. Yes. Well, Eli wasn't living the way he should have. Eli was the priest of the Lord, high priest. He has two sons. The two sons were worthless. They were womanizers. They were thieves. People would bring their food offerings, offering meat offerings and such like that, and they would snag out the priest was always allowed to stab, out of the pot, if you will, and because they ate from the offerings. That's how the priests operated, and properly so. But you can stab, and whatever you came out, that's what you got. But that wasn't for them. They wanted the filet mignon, and so they were essentially abusing the people, abusing their position as the sons of Eli. Eli knows what they're doing, but he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't discipline his own kids, and he lets them basically take advantage of the people and abuse the things of God, treat it like it's just common. And so God says, I'm not into that. That's not the way we operate here. And so then, when they treat the Ark of the Covenant like some kind of a magical device, so the Philistines are coming, and so, okay, well, if we get the Ark, we'll take our magical device and we'll go out against the Philistines. Well, the magical device works as long as God is in it. But when God abandons it, it's just a piece of metal you're hauling around. And so that was what, God had dealt with Eli. He didn't really do what he should. And so that was the revelation that God gave to Samuel. When he said, I'm going to follow through on this. And Eli said to him, you tell me what he said. He said, you won't like this. He said, no, you tell me exactly what God said. And so Samuel told him. And so Eli knew exactly what was going to happen. But apparently, if that had been me, I'd have said, oh boy, I got to do something about this. And, maybe it won't be too late. And maybe God will still help me if I ask him to forgive me, which is what they should have done and changed the way things were. But he still didn't do anything about it. And so God said, no, we're not going to do that. So he withdrew his presence from it, and the ark was lost, and Israel was lost in that moment. So the question was, what happened at Shiloh that, with regard to God? Yes. Yes, the question is, wasn't that where the tribe? Yes, they met there three times a year, because just like later they would go to Jerusalem, because God always said, you go to the place where I will show you. And the place where he showed them for the first 369 years was Shiloh. The ark is lost for a period of time. David finally restores it, through that circuitous thing, and he finally prepares in Jerusalem, what is now Temple Mount. Anyway, so that was kind of the journey that it went on. Yeah. Yes, sir. Well, Bethel means house of God. House El of God. Shiloh. I should know this. Does anybody know what the meaning of Shiloh is? Hey Siri, what's the meaning of Shiloh? Well, it's a site of the Battle of the Civil War. Obviously, Siri. Yeah, it is true. Yeah, but Siri is not biblically literate, apparently. Although on many other subjects, I found that he or she is. But I don't remember the meaning of Shiloh. I do have a good buddy who, not a good buddy, he was a high school friend who Shilohans. He was the founder of those. But Mark Hemstreet. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Want to ask one more question? Yeah. That the proper noun is Shiloh. That might be the Hebrew way.
And my second question, I heard only part of it. Why do you think that the tumors were actually hemorrhoids?
It's a textual from the text that indicates that. The interpretation that what's translated tumors, if you go back and read that passage and do a word study on that word, I believe you'll find that out. Yeah, thank you. The question was, how do we know that tumors means hemorrhoid? Shiloh means, oh yeah, Shiloh means peace. I should have known that. I think I did know that, but then there's a lot of things I once knew that I no longer know. Yeah, yeah. It's that's it. That's back to that question of how do we know the location of this? I once knew, I just don't know now. Okay, well we'll let that be the end. Thank you all for coming tonight. Let's stand, have a word of prayer. We'll let you be on your way. Father God, we bless you tonight. We thank you for your peace that comes upon us. I pray, Lord, that you would help us, especially, Lord, if anybody here tonight realizes that they've kind of wandered from the right path, that they would call upon your mercy and call upon your grace and ask for your help. Lord, don't abandon us, we pray. Keep us close to yourself. Help us, Lord, and when we're wrong, correct us and deal with us, Lord, so that we'll make heaven our home with great joy. Bless your people tonight now as we go our separate ways. In Christ's name, amen.